and welcome to Macro Matters. My name is Stephanie Kelly, and along with Paul Diggle, we'll be guiding you through the often weird, sometimes wonderful world of economics, politics, and markets. This week, we're recording in the wake of an unusually fractious US presidential debate, and in particular, it's trading barbs over the president's ability to manage the coronavirus and the president's concerns about Biden's ability to become president in the future.
The issue is the American people should speak. You should go out and vote. You're in voting now. Vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now.
Are you going to pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know
He doesn't want
you're a
to answer the
senator.
question.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why wouldn't you answer that
because
question?
the question
You want to put a lot of new Supreme Court justices, radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
This
Who's
is
on your
so
list?
Right, gentlemen, I think
this
we've
is
ended
so
this.
unprecedented.
He's going to pack the court.
We have,
So there we heard both President Trump and Joe Biden in an unusually aggressive US presidential debate. Clearly, the US election is becoming front and center for investors across the world, and we're increasingly looking at how it might affect both the economic outlook and also the investment environment. And I'm delighted to say that today, joining us is Robby Mook, who's an American political strategist. He's run multiple major election campaigns for the Democratic Party, and most notably was the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Robby's now a fellow at the Harvard Belford Center and the president of the House Majority PAC, which is a group that works on fundraising and strategy for Democratic House campaigns. Thank you, Robby, so much for joining us.
oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So it's great to have Robby with us because it's a great opportunity to really dig into what's driving this election. And then afterwards, we'll talk about what the investment implications are. But maybe up front, Robby, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a difficult question, which is, who do you think is going to win the US presidential election? And if you had to give one reason for that, what would it be?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think every American is a little bit nervous about prognosticating this time, given how surprising the result was last time. But look, based on everything I can see, I think this is really Joe Biden's race to lose at this point. If I had to name one reason for that, honestly, I think the biggest is COVID, and it really changed this race from what I expected it to be, which was kind of a debate about, economic growth and taxes and that sort of thing, to really a referendum on Donald Trump's leadership as president. And I think that anytime an incumbent president is running for re-election, the thing they don't want is a laser focus on their presidency and a referendum on their presidency. They want a choice. And I think that he's doing everything he can to break that dynamic, but it's going to be hard.
Right. And I think that that's really what you saw, I guess, last night in terms of the kinds of debates. This morning, the question was kind of like, what policies were actually discussed and, who had the upper hand on policy? Well, actually, it was kind of hard to tell, right? Because there was just so much, I guess, direct conflict between the two partners, but more around their personalities and their values. Do you think that it's fair to say that this kind of election is going to be driven more so on those issues, kind of values and personalities, rather than necessarily actual policy?
Well, I think that's what Trump wants. And to be honest with you, this is where I have a slightly different take than some of my colleagues. I think Biden did fine. I don't think Biden did anything wrong. But I think what Biden is facing is this reality with Trump, where he's going to do everything he can to make this a food fight. And so I actually think in that regard, the president made not enough progress. He really has to turn this around to succeed. But I actually think if you were behind the scenes with his team, they'd be saying to themselves, well, at least we just made it a mess. We didn't talk about what Trump did right or wrong very much.
Right. So
which is depressing, by the way. I don't think that's a good thing. But I think sadly that's the reality.
Yeah. I guess the political realities here are quite grim, and I think that was roundly in both the right and the left-wing media overnight. There seems to be on both sides a kind of a grim reaction to the nature of the debate that went on. I'm interested to understand, compared to when you were running the campaign for Clinton, 4 years ago, how different is 2020, and I guess what are the are there any challenges that Clinton faced, particularly, I mean, there was a lot around her gender and also her kind of pre-existing reputation. Are there different challenges that Biden faces in terms of this election versus Trump?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think the biggest difference from 2016 is Trump's an incumbent now, right? He has a leadership record. He can be held accountable, and so the dynamic between the two candidates is totally different. In 2016, Hillary was really treated almost as if she was an incumbent. She kind of, she had to own the last 8 years of the Obama administration. She was basically treated as someone who had been in the office for a long time. So that's very different for Biden. He can run as an outside, he can run as an opposition to the way things are, which Hillary could not. And I actually think, going back to the debate for a second, I actually think Trump is better. He is better suited to being an incumbent in debates, ironically, because normally incumbent presidents don't do so well in their first debate. They get very defensive. They haven't prepared as well. Trump's bombastic and pugilistic personality is actually good for a way for him to just come out the door swinging, which is what he did. Again, I'm not condoning his behavior in this debate at all, but I think Biden has to tweak the playbook, I think, for challenger candidates a little bit, because he's dealing with someone who is on offense all the time and won't engage in a substantive kind of give and take on his record, and it's complicated, and you could see him kind of trying to balance like not getting pushed over, but at the same time not stooping to Trump's level. But it's hard because it's very easy for the media to say, well, both sides were lousy, and I think that's gonna, not just at the debates, I think for the remaining month here, that's going to be a struggle for Biden, is to keep this about COVID and not just, well, look at both of these candidates, they're both down in the mud and it's gotten really nasty. I think Hillary felt that was really hard for us on the Clinton campaign.
Right. No, I think that's super useful. Definitely that idea that, for Trump, the best defense is a good offense, and clearly a realm in which he kind of feels most comfortable. I might switch briefly then to the question of polling, and in particular, have you been surprised at the extent of Biden's lead, but also just how stable it's been?
Yeah, this feels particularly ironic for me, because Obama's polling had also been remarkably steady, particularly in 2012. It took a bit of a dip after that first debate event when, like normal, as an incumbent, he struggled a little bit. But it really recovered and didn't change that much. We're seeing something similar now. I think on the Clinton campaign, we really struggled day to day to decide, okay, is this dip we're seeing today noise or are we dipping? And particularly, what James Comey did was so late in the game, it was really hard to assess anything because it was just a matter of days. But I think we should, as a Democrat, I take some confidence in that stability. That makes me feel more optimistic. And then obviously, Biden's fundamentals are just stronger, than unfortunately for Hillary, than we had 4 years ago. He's above 50 in a lot of these states. His favorability is a little bit higher. Although I do always point out Trump's favorabilities were lower than Hillary's. It's not like he was. People sometimes make that mistake. It's not like he was more popular than her. So I think that's kind of less important as a metric. But the thing I do try to always point out, I feel very good about where Biden is today. However, if this thing moves, a point or two, that has a dramatic effect on the Electoral College. And I still maintain today it's probably the likeliest scenario that Joe Biden's winning. He needs 270, that he's getting 280 to 290. It's possible this is a blowout. It's also possible that Trump wins. I think that most likely scenario right now, is a 10 to 20 electoral vote win. So that's not something we should feel super confident about. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that we just got to keep the pedal to the metal. And as I mentioned earlier, I worry if this narrative changes to what a mess. That I think net hurts Biden. So that's why I think we need to remain very vigilant as Democrats right now.
So, Robbie, when you look at the two candidates, when you look at Trump and when you look at Biden, it sounds like from what you're saying that, Trump maybe has a little less to lose when it comes to event risk. And in particular, I'm thinking back to 2016. And as you mentioned, the Comey letter and the impact that that had on Clinton's campaign. I'm interested, do you think that really it is Biden's to lose now in terms of, these kind of freak events that can happen or scandals that come out? It seems a little bit like the tax scandal hasn't really impacted Trump in any real way. And do you expect that to basically be the way it plays going forward? That really it is just about how much does the lead narrow rather than that lead actually kind of widening out again?
Yeah, I do think that Trump has the most to gain from a disruption at this point for the simple reason that he's losing right now, right? And when you're losing, right, you need the dynamic to change, and so anything has opportunity, anything has potential. I do think it obviously depends what kind of disruption that is. If we have a natural disaster, which we could, hurricane in Florida and North Carolina, and he doesn't handle that well, and he loses Florida as a result, well, that's really bad. But, I could also argue if there's an economic disruption, ironically, it could help Trump because it could put more focus on economic recovery where Trump does have a bit of an advantage. So this could cut a few different ways. But yeah, Trump needs something to change. So risk, I think, is in his favor right now.
Right. No, I think that's crystal clear. So then if we think then, obviously we've talked about the presidentials a lot. Obviously that's what a lot of the media coverage is. But, for investors, we're always trying to stress that it's not just about who's in the White House. It really matters who's in the House and who's in the Senate. So maybe if I push that over to you and say, today, if you had to guess, I'm assuming you expect the Democrats to hold their majority in the House, and maybe you can talk about why people seem so kind of confident on that. But what do you think is going to happen in the Senate?
I'm going to add one thing on to what you said there, too, which is I also think it matters how many members Democrats have in the Senate. It's very different to have a majority of 51 versus a majority of 60, right? But going back to the House for a second, I do feel very sanguine about Democrats in the House, mostly because the gains Democrats have seen in 2018 and that we'll probably see a small net gain this year in 2020 have been in the suburbs, where Democrats are going to do very well versus 2016 this time, kind of no matter what, I think. So that will just deliver some House seats. I think the Senate's a toss-up, but I think at best the Democrats get to 51 seats. That doesn't give them very much room to maneuver. If we win the White House, we've got to have 50 votes so we can lose one member on any given vote. That's not a big margin. Now, I'd say the caucus in the Senate is more ideologically aligned than it's been, than it was when Obama first came in, for example. But it's really hard to push for particularly controversial legislation when your majority is so slim. And it requires, by the way, getting rid of the filibuster as well.
Well, this is exactly what I was going to just ask you, which is around the filibuster, because obviously we get a lot of questions about whether they'll completely remove it or whether they'll just vote to constrain parts of it. I'm interested to understand, from your perspective, what's likely and then what's possible in terms of the filibuster.
Yeah, here's the thing. There used to be a day when you could get laws through the Senate, somewhat irrespective of which party was in power, because you had a lot of aisle crossing between the parties. Those days are really over. And so the filibuster has essentially turned into a mechanism to just kill anything the majority party wants to do. And that's why you've seen it already, curtailed. The Republicans certainly pulled it back for the purpose of getting a bunch of judges through. I think there's honestly, within the party, I think there's a growing sense of urgency, really from a moral standpoint, that, when I think about the issue of climate change in particular, if having the filibuster in place means Democrats lose another 10 years on getting a climate bill passed, it's really hard to justify from a moral standpoint having it in place. And I think that's where people's heads really are. If there's a way to work with Republicans, if there's a way to get to 60 votes, if there's a way to do something versus nothing, maybe it can stay. I just don't see, given this Republican caucus, any way that
Democrats are even able to get anything at all done on issues like climate change, or prescription drug prices. And so for that reason, it's probably going to go, and it probably should go.
Right. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And you think that'll happen fairly quickly, or you think it'll take time for them to figure out there's an issue and that they're going to have to move on it?
Well, there's just an issue off the bat that you've got to move quickly to just get things done. These things take way longer than you think. And so, it may be that Democrats, for messaging purposes, leave the option, leave it on the table and then remove it if it's just clear they're getting nowhere. I mean, here a great example of this to me is Lindsey Graham used to support a cap and trade bill, for climate change.
Right.
That seems like a different universe today, but that was 10 years ago. I just think we've changed so much. They'll probably have to get rid of it pretty early on if they want to do anything at all.
I think that's kind of interesting, actually, because in a way you're saying like the polarization that's gone on means that Democrats are more incentivized to remove the filibuster. But then by removing the filibuster, assumedly that will just create potentially an environment in which policy swings pretty wildly from left to right, depending on who's in power, right? And in particular, one of the things that we get a lot of questions on is around the Supreme Court and whether, in the absence of the filibuster, do you just end up in this kind of bizarre, never-ending increase in the number of Supreme Court justices as kind of each side tries to consolidate power? I mean, are these real scenarios we should be kind of worried about and thinking about? I
don't know. I would have two things to say to that question. The first is that I think for the court, it really probably depends on what they do. If this court, eliminates the Affordable Care Act overnight and 20 million Americans lose their health insurance, if they immediately strip away a woman's, right to reproductive health care, I think there's going to be a sense in the Democratic Party, but I think just in public opinion that some check needs to be put in place, right? I'm actually maybe I'm overly optimistic. I am hopeful the court acts responsibly and doesn't become kind of an ideological activist organization. But if real people are losing their access to healthcare, that's kind of a crisis, And then the second, which is interrelated, is we've actually seen in the last few years with not just Justice Roberts, but Gorsuch and so on, I don't think they've gone to that place, right? Justice Roberts voted to keep the Affordable Care Act. These justices ruled for transgender rights recently, right? So now Ginsburg was part of the math for all that. But I think there's a scenario where this court demonstrates a much more moderate tone, and that's probably the best thing it could do, to prevent, just more justices being added willy-nilly. And then the second thing I'd say, you ask a very important question about, okay, well, if Democrats get rid of the filibuster and, and pass, say, a climate bill or a prescription drug bill, is it the Republicans just come in 2 years later and just totally repeal everything? The Affordable Care Act to me is a great example where it's still here. It's survived Republican majorities in both chambers and the White House. It survived the Supreme Court. I'm optimistic that things like climate, the cost of prescription drugs, the cost of healthcare are so popular and so necessary that despite what I'm putting on my partisan hat a little bit, but despite what the Republicans say, they know these are the right things to do. They couldn't repeal Obamacare because they didn't have a better solution. They knew it was the best thing. So that's where I am actually optimistic that whatever we can get done, if Democrats do have control, will remain in place because these things are they're just overdue.
I think that's a super useful kind of summary, particularly of where you're feeling around maybe a little bit of optimism for bipartisanship at a time when it feels kind of tricky to feel too optimistic. And maybe just one final question. Obviously, the Democrats have very far-reaching fiscal plans in terms of both increasing taxes on corporates and high-income earners, but also massively ramping up spending, particularly in areas like education, healthcare, infrastructure, the kind of Green New Deal work, and as well as the Jobs Act. And so against the backdrop of all that, one of the big question marks we have is, if the Democrats get a majority in the Senate, will they be able to just do all of that? Is the party aligned around that? And then the second question is, if the Democrats don't get a majority in the Senate, but Joe Biden does win the White House, which, as you've suggested, is kind of a toss-up, are we looking at just complete fiscal gridlock like what we saw in the Obama administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think if Democrats control both chambers, I think there is broad alignment. And by the way, not just within the Democratic Party, but I think there's alignment. You know, you look at what the Fed is saying. I think there's interestingly alignment between Wall Street and the Democratic Party that we need a major infrastructure bill, right? We need the infrastructure to grow the economy. But we also need to get people back to work. The question is, what's the Republican Party going to do? By the way, Donald Trump supports a major infrastructure investment as well. The problem is, and this is where I'm concerned if Mitch McConnell remains the leader of the Senate, is he just will not entertain any changes to the tax code that the Republicans passed. And he won't commit to this spending that, again, I would just argue it's terrible economic policy. McConnell's incentive structure is to, continue raising money from a set of interests and maintaining popularity in his caucus. And if the Republicans are out of power, the Republican senators are going to be shifting their focus to running for president. And they're all going to be talking to Republican primary electorate, and they didn't care about debt. Now I'm putting on my partisan hat. They didn't care at all about debt when they passed their spending bills and their tax bill. You're going to hear them talk about debt every day as soon as Joe Biden becomes president. And so sadly, I think it's going to be hard to get anything done.
Well, I think that's quite consistent, unfortunately, with some of our expectations around the economic environment under different outcomes, which we're going to switch to now in a moment. But first of all, thank you so much, Robby, for joining us. We really appreciate your time, particularly. I'm sure you're very busy in the run-up to this election, and we really appreciate the chance to chat and get your views on all of this.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Robby.
So for the second segment, Steph is now moving to the other side of the mic and is in the metaphorical hot seat. And I'm going to ask her to reflect on some of the issues and points that Robby was making and translate them into what they mean for our economic forecast and what they mean for investors. So Steph, why don't we maybe start off by asking, did the debate in any way change your baseline forecast of what's going to happen in this election?
Simple phrase, no. I don't think it's changed absolutely anything about either the election itself or indeed the investment implications of it. It's reinforced some trends, but it hasn't changed them.
Yeah, and I suppose the historical pattern is, of course, that these debates, while they generate a lot of media attention, don't seem to have huge impacts on the race itself.
Yeah, exactly. Especially, particularly a debate which was so unusually fractious and so unusually hot-headed on both sides. We really didn't learn very much about the policy positions. So, the potential for someone to get caught out actually just didn't happen because they were arguing so kind of aggressively with each other that it just didn't create the space for someone to have a major gaffe, which is obviously going in what particularly, market expectations broadly tracking towards a Biden victory. A poor performance from him might have changed that, but that didn't take place because they both just went at each other.
Yeah. So one of the, I think, really points Robby was making was the importance of the different combinations or permutations of result that we could get. So both the presidency and then what happens in Congress as well. And particularly the result in the Senate, whether it flips Democrat or remains Republican, is very key to the outcome. So could you talk us through what the main permutations are there and what they mean for the economic and investment outlook?
Sure, of course. So there's kind of four possible outcomes to my mind. It's basically Biden with a clean sweep, which is where the Democrats would have majority in both the House and the Senate, or Biden with a split Congress where Republicans hold on to the majority in Senate. And then the other two scenarios are where Trump wins either with split Congress, whereby the Democrats still hold on to the House for the reasons that Robby talked about earlier on, and then the alternative, which is that Trump wins, but then he ends up with a majority for Republicans in both houses, right? So that's the broad way. I think to start off with, let's talk about the base case, which is we expect a Democrat clean sweep. That's our base case at the moment, albeit with relatively low conviction levels in that, given all the uncertainty about the Senate. And that's an environment in which we expect fiscal support to continue, and in particular for there to be quite a significant shift in the composition of fiscal policy from what we're used to today.
Right, and some of the possible fiscal bill that we could see under that type of administration that Robby was touching on were things like a climate bill and an infrastructure bill. Particularly a climate bill, I mean, that presumably has quite widespread economic and market implications if the US is doing an awful lot more on climate goals.
Yes, absolutely, especially against the backdrop of the Trump presidency, which we know has been somewhat not only not pushing forward on climate change objectives, but actually actively rolling back quite a lot of the environmental protections that had been put in place, for example, by the Obama administration. And so under a Democratic presidency, and especially with Congress, but even without, I'd expect significant progress to be made in the regulatory sphere. Now, obviously, the risk is that anything that's regulated by the president can get pulled through the courts and kind of lawsuits pushed against it. So that's a risk, but I would expect that under a Biden presidency, particularly a clean sweep, we would see climate at the center, not as its own policy, but actually as part of every policy decision that gets made and every economic decision that gets made. And green jobs, green infrastructure, all that stuff implies that spending for green isn't just specifically on climate stuff, but it's actually integrated into fundamental linchpins in that policy agenda around the labor force, around infrastructure, around the way in which the government approaches climate, which currently is basically not included whatsoever in a Republican administration.
So the second of those permutations was the Biden presidency, but continued split Congress. And that actually has potentially quite adverse economic and investment implications. Perhaps you could explain why, Steph?
Yeah, I mean, there's usually an assumption that, a bit of policy gridlock can be good for investors because it means the government's not getting too involved, or you're not looking at major policy swings in either direction, and maybe very little gets done, but maybe that's not a bad thing. I don't think that we're there in the US at the US case at the moment because of COVID and the significant damage it's done both in terms of health and economics, means that we really think fiscal support is needed through 2021 and indeed potentially beyond. And if the Republicans can hold on to their majority in the Senate, as Robby spoke to, you see that kind of partisanship really come to the fore. Republicans refusing to pass any tax increases, which would be required to fund parts of the spending agenda, but also potentially refusing to, pass just pure fiscal stimulus for the purposes of COVID support. All of that is much more problematic than, if they manage to get a majority, which, yes, means a different composition for fiscal policy, but at least fiscal policy is being done and fiscal support is being provided to the economy. Without it, we're really concerned about the trajectory for growth in the US in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I suppose that's especially important when you've got monetary policy increasingly struggling to gain traction in terms of supporting the economy. So fiscal policy is going to become just much more important in this sort of post-COVID period where you've
Absolutely.
got monetary not being able to do as much. So yeah, potentially some quite adverse economic outcomes there. So those permutations that involve Trump holding the presidency, then I suppose would we say that the one that involves the clean sweep of the Republicans in Congress is more likely than a Trump presidency and a split Congress because you've got sort of down ballot voting, which means the Republicans do well, or would you disagree with that?
So I think I'd probably say that for the Senate, the down ballot effect can be quite profound. So if Trump has a good night, you'd expect the Senate to hold on to their majority. But in the House, the down ballot effect doesn't really work the same way for various reasons. But in particular, the Democratic Party did quite well in 2018 in terms of gaining footholds, and the outlook for the elections that are due to take place in the House are very positive. And so the expectation, I think, we definitely put about, I think we have something like a 25% chance that Trump wins the election with a Republican Senate but a Democratic House, and then we've got 10% for that kind of Republican clean sweep. And it just reflects the differences between the kind of dynamics driving the House election versus the dynamics driving the Senate election.
Right, understood. And the second Trump term, what do we think this means economically and perhaps the read across for markets as well?
So I think in a way the Trump administration is a sort of a BAU scenario, but with a caveat. And the caveat will be, it does depend obviously whether the Republicans have a majority if they manage to get a majority in the House, which as I said is quite difficult to do, then they could look at doing things like lowering taxes further after the initial round of tax cuts that they did back at the beginning of Trump's presidency. So you might get a little bit of more kind of corporate tax relief, maybe a bit more high income tax relief or wealth tax relief, but for the most part, it's kind of a BAU scenario. What might be a little bit concerning is that clearly Republicans are more concerned now about providing more stimulus to the economy after the major bill that was passed earlier this year. And so against that backdrop, we might be a little bit worried that no more major stimulus is coming at a time when, ideally the economy continues to see support, particularly around unemployment insurance, et cetera. So that's probably the risk that comes in. And then obviously, if the Democrats still have the House, it's much more challenging for them to do any kind of tax cuts. And so you probably get a consistent theme to what we've seen before, which is difficult negotiations, but ultimately getting a fiscal deal of some description, just because Democrats tend to support the government intervening in the economy more so than the Republicans do.
And how much sort of weight are you putting on arguments that a second Trump term is Trump unchained and unbound, and the sort of the norm violations that some think have characterized his term are even more prominent in a second term because there's no re-election required, and perhaps the composition of his cabinet isn't the sort of the mainstream figures it was at least at the start of his first term?
I would say that I'm not super convinced that he has been overly, fettered by the constraints of the party, and in particular, part of the strength of Trump's administration and his election has actually been in pulling the Republican Party towards a more, a stance that's more comfortable with his norm violation than the other way around. He hasn't massively been corralled towards kind of a mainstream approach. Very little of what we've seen in the trade policy space, for example, has been particularly mainstream. Maybe he might push for a little bit more on the fiscal spending side if he doesn't face another re-election, because he doesn't have to rely on Republicans quite as much. But again, it's harder to call that. I think realistically, we see Trump relatively unfettered for the last 4 years, and if he gets another 4 years, likely the same again. In some ways, having the re-election campaign, you can kind of call it either way, right? Does he think he needs to moderate, or does he think he got elected because he is who he is and he just needs to keep being himself, and that will get him re-elected? And that does seem, based on his debate performance, that seems to be the tactic.
So, Steph, perhaps a final question for this segment, and it's a question we've been getting a lot, is are the scenarios involving a contested result on the night where it's unclear who's won, perhaps it takes days of counting results subsequently, perhaps the result is sort of decided in the courts or somewhere else, are these scenarios ones investors should be worrying about, or are they instead sort of tail risk scenarios that would, they make a good film, but they're not really plausible real life scenarios?
So I think, investors have a lot to worry about with this election, not only because I think it's never 100% clear when the actual election outcome comes to pass what that means for markets. And I think particularly under our Democrat clean sweep, it's going to be challenging for investors to try and price not only the positive macro impact of, sustained fiscal stimulus and fiscal policy, but then against that backdrop, the sector by sector differences, as the Democratic Party clearly is pursuing this kind of different composition of fiscal policy, raising corporate tax rates, and particularly targeting greater regulation on key sectors like financials and tech. So against that backdrop, that's hard enough. Then you add in these scenarios that people talk about around basically a failure in the peaceful transition of power. I think the actual reality of whether President Trump can stay in the White House if he is not reelected, I think that's an extreme tail risk. However, there can be, and he has intimated that he is likely to create challenges in the kind of period after the election during the counting, after the counting, and then afterwards, he's called into question the validity of mail-in votes. And he's also talked about, potentially challenging results. And especially if we've got a close race, which I think is likely in a number of states, then you're likely to see President Trump and his team contesting those results. You'll have recounts. The Supreme Courts can get involved. It can really escalate. And there are legal potholes such that it's not 100% clear that this will be an easy, straightforward transition in the way that we are used to as investors. So I think it's doubly tricky because the outlook after the transition period is somewhat difficult to price and really depends on your sector exposure. But even before that, the amount of media and political chaos that's likely to be created will really create clouds on the investment horizon, such that understanding the returns environment over the next 4 months is going to be exceedingly tricky. And I think we should be prepared for not just an election day, but election weeks and even potentially election months.
Indeed. So I suppose that's the right point to end, as if investors didn't have enough to worry about. This is yet another thing that's on the horizon that we have to be monitoring and navigating in this tricky environment. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Steph, and thank you again to our guest, Robby Mook. And please join us next time where we'll continue to explore the interesting, weird and wacky world, sometimes of economics and politics.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.